Hello, everyone. I'm Gloria Greer. As a journalist for over 35 years, I have interviewed some of the most interesting people of our time. I interviewed Julie Nixon Eisenhower in February of 2002, at a time when George W. Bush was still a popular president. Please join us as we look back at classic conversations. 30 years ago, President Richard Nixon was here in our valley to participate in the dedication of the Eisenhower Medical Center. Now, 30 years later, his daughter, Julie Nixon Eisenhower, is a member of the Board of Trustees and the Board of Governors of that hospital and medical center. And it is a great pleasure to have Julie Nixon Eisenhower on this program. I'm going to say a few things about you first because she's a remarkable woman. She has written 3 books, which we're going to talk about later. She was a managing editor for the Saturday Evening Post for a number of years, and when she made travels around the globe for a number of years, she was named one of the 10 most outstanding women.
By Good Housekeeping.
By Good Housekeeping. That's pretty good. Julie, thank you for coming here. I'm just thrilled.
Well, Gloria, it's so good to see you. And I had a chance to visit with you last year when I was in the desert.
Right.
And it's great to be back and to see you.
Thank you so much. You know, you live in Philadelphia.
Right.
And I know that your husband is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yes, his students adore him. He's the kind of professor who gives everyone the home phone number. They call him at all hours. In fact, last spring, one student called at midnight and I answered the phone, you know, groggily, hello, and I said, do you know what time it is? Because his student, you know, just so enthusiastic about a comment David had made on the paper he was writing, wasn't thinking of the time, he just knew he had to talk to the prof.
Isn't that wonderful?
But David loves teaching, and he's now also editing a journal, a foreign affairs journal called Orbis for the Foreign Affairs Institute in Philadelphia. So he's enjoying that. Very
interesting. But what I was going to ask you is the fact that you are so busy in Philadelphia, and you're on many boards there. So how do you have the time to participate in the Eisenhower Medical Center board, as well, of course, as your father, the Richard Nixon Library and birthplace? I know you're on the Board of Trustees of that. So what made you decide to do all that?
Well, since the children are now growing up, I only have one at home in high school and one in college and one just out of college. I have an opportunity to travel a little more. I didn't like to leave them when they were young because I know how hard it was for Tricia and me when my parents, because of their duties with the overseas travels and the campaign trips, to be gone from us. So I have a little more time. It's not an empty nest. In fact, my graduate of Northwestern has come home to live.
Really?
So we're getting along pretty well. She's 23. I just keep the door to her room closed at all times. That's how it works.
Okay. You don't look in.
I don't look in. And other than that, we're doing beautifully. But I know a lot of parents can identify with that. When your older child comes home and suddenly you know, they're a young adult, but it's still your house, I think. I think it's still our house.
But the Eisenhower Medical Center,
yes,
because of the fact that you, for so many years, really were not active at all, and then you came out last year, and now all of a sudden you are on the Board of Trustees and the Board of Governors. So what made you decide that this was the time to do that?
Well, I couldn't be active before because it's so far to come to California, and any time that I had to come to California, I needed to go to Los Angeles to help with my father's presidential library, because we're the only presidential library out of the 12 that exist which doesn't receive federal funds. So I do a great deal of fundraising for them and help them develop programs to use the facility. We have weddings there and bar mitzvahs and graduations, and we have an income that way. And in our gift shop, if you like Elvis, you can get anything Elvis. There's a picture of my father and the King and Elvis in the Oval Office, which is the most requested photograph at the National Archives. There's a special extension you dial when you want the Nixon Elvis photo. It's so requested. Anyway, we have magnets, we have napkins, we have mugs. So anyway, it's fun.
Fascinating.
But the Eisenhower, seriously, on the Eisenhower Medical Center, this, I think, is probably the finest tribute to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Can there be a greater honor than to have a place of medicine and learning and science named for you? And Mamie Eisenhower was so dedicated to the hospital, and I visited the hospital with her. David and I were with her in 1978. And there was, I can't even remember, it was something new had been added on, and we had a beautiful time. The Hopes were there, and so many of the Eisenhower's friends from the desert. And I just want to carry on the tradition of family involvement with the hospital because it's just a marvelous institution. Gloria, I was amazed when I started getting involved to learn that the hospital has 800 active volunteers. I've never heard of anything like that.
That's fairly.
I really haven't. We have a huge corps at Nixon Library. I think we have 120 docents, which is one of the biggest docent guilds of the presidential libraries, but 800 active volunteers. I mean, there's such spirit at the hospital.
Yeah, well, there's, as you know, there's so much spirit here for philanthropy, really,
yes,
in this desert.
In the desert,
and of
right.
course, you spent time here as a child, so did your husband, and of course, David Eisenhower is the grandson.
That's right.
Of General Eisenhower, also the former president. So you and David really are a part of history, so much so.
Well, we certainly would like to claim Palm Desert as part of our history. And one funny thing that I want to share with you. A lot of the work that we do for the Eisenhower memory is centered in Abilene, Kansas. Now, I don't have anything against Abilene, but if you had a chance to visit Abilene and Palm Desert, so it's a great thrill to be on the desert. The Eisenhowers loved it.
Oh, I know.
They spent 6 months of the year out here and the other 6 months in Gettysburg.
I had the great privilege of interviewing, and I have that somewhere in my files, Mamie Eisenhower and your mother together.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
It was in 1963 then.
I don't know.
I know it was,
and
because that would have been the only time they would have been together on the desert.
Right.
Your
father was running for governor, I believe, at that time.
I was just going to amend that.
Yeah.
I remember so vividly that visit. It was 1961. And Gloria, I am thrilled you had that interview. Is there any way that the Nixon Library could have that?
I have to
their
look for
archives?
it and find it.
Because that's a unique thing to have two first ladies.
Yeah.
Very unusual. But I want to tell you why I remember that visit. President Eisenhower was an amateur artist. And he used to, if you would go into his studio, the postman could come by and say, "Oh, Ike, I like that painting." He'd say, "Here, take it." He didn't think he was any good. He was actually very good. So my mother, when we went to the desert on that visit, we went and visited the Eisenhowers in their home at El Dorado, and the general had several easels set up in the sunroom. And my mother finally got up her courage and she said, "I would love to have one of your paintings." And so there were two choices. One was a beautiful snow scene, and the other was a scene of palm trees. And my mother, thinking that we would never live in the East again, said, "I'd like the snow scene." So that hangs in David's in my home now.
How lovely.
Painted on the desert.
How lovely. We were talking before, you mentioned that one of your daughters had come home. But you have a daughter who is an actress.
She is, and she graduated from Northwestern, went to New York for a year, was in 3 shows, including
is this the same daughter
Off-Broadway, yes, and then decided she really didn't like New York and the whole scene.
Yeah.
She's home and she's doing some local theater. In fact, she just auditioned for Nonsense. She's very vivacious. And so I think it's the nun that's very cheerful.
Right, I think so.
Perpetua, I'm not sure what her name is. And she has applied to get her PhD at grad school, and she's waiting to hear from schools.
Now, you have 3 offspring,
right.
And none of them have a desire to go into politics, right?
David and I did such a great job in assuring the kids that they didn't have to worry about the name, the legacy, be yourself. We overdid it. No interest in politics, no interest at all, maybe down the road, but we did really want them to feel that they didn't have to think about carrying the name of 2 presidents. It's a burden. And so, again, perhaps we didn't encourage enough interest in public affairs, but they wouldn't even think about politics.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, they're very much into the arts. And
Well, you must have also been very interested in the arts then as well, I would presume.
Well,
and
I
David.
encouraged all their, I encouraged the guitar playing, the drum playing, the music lessons, and the ballet. So.
Now, when you talk about the pressure or the feeling of history, and they did not have to carry that on.
Yes.
But you actually, I would think that from being a small child, your father was in politics. You really grew up with it.
I did, and so I really didn't have a choice. But certainly with them, they were enough removed that there was a choice. One thing that was marvelous about my parents is that as Trish and I got older, they included us in conversations and in the big dramas of their lives. In other words, we were part of the campaigns. We campaigned with them in 68 and 72. At the dinner table, my father would talk about what was happening. He was very generous in sharing with the family some of the strategies and things that were going on, made us feel part of it, which I loved. And of course, that's why I remain so intensely interested in everything that is happening today.
Yeah, when you had so many highs and lows.
Yes.
Did the lows in any way strengthen you, do you feel?
I know there's that old theory that adversity strengthens you, and my take on it is a little different. We all have adversity, and I don't really think that adversity strengthens you, but each one of us faces adversity, and we just have to work through it. But I think adversity is difficult, and I don't think that it makes character better or worse, because everyone has adversity. It's just how you approach it and whether or not you can try to keep associating with people who are positive and who keep fighting on. And this new generation of young Americans who don't know my dad, who never knew him as president, what they admire about him, despite Watergate or despite his great achievements, no matter putting all that aside, they like the fact he was a fighter.
And
that's what appeals. Mm-hmm. He always came back. Mm-hmm. And that's what we all have to do in life.
Did the Watergate experience, did that hurt your mother's health? I mean, she became ill after that.
I think it was very grueling. The White House years were very grueling because my dad was a wartime president. The war was not ended until 1973, and then he had a year and a half more of the presidency left, and the country was so divided. So it wasn't a time of peace in the White House. There were demonstrations. It was also the women's liberation movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, the Weather Underground. It was a time of great turbulence. Yeah. And I think it all was cumulative. But what was so great about my mother is she had her stroke in '76, but made a complete recovery.
How wonderful.
If you had met her in the subsequent years, mm-hmm. she didn't walk with a limp. You could tell there was no sign at all of the stroke. Mm-hmm. So she was great.
How do you feel your father will go down in history?
He will go down with a mixed legacy, but I think in the end that historians cannot ignore the fact that he really laid the groundwork for the end of the Cold War.
That's right.
Going to China, breaking apart the Sino-Soviet bloc, this really changed the world. It changed things profoundly. Bringing China back into the family of nations was a very important thing to do.
When you were in the White House and your privacy, you don't have privacy.
None,
How do you
no.
cope with that?
I think that's what's so hard. It's so difficult to have Secret Service. You just can't imagine. But then again, you've got all these wonderful stories to tell later, right?
Like what?
Like the time that when David and I were first married, and we were still in college. Don't tell my kids we got married in college, by the way. We had a fight, and we had it at this $90 a month apartment on the Smith College campus, and it was above. The Secret Service were living in the basement, and ours was the first floor apartment, but it was a pretty big drop to the floor. Well, we'd had this fight. Well, I was going to go for a walk, by golly, and I wasn't going to have Secret Service trailing me. So I jumped out of the window of our bedroom and went for a walk by myself along the streets of Northampton and felt quite liberated. But then I had a problem. I couldn't get back in the window because without letting the Secret Service know, and I didn't want to get them in trouble. Oh, I don't know. It was sort of a sad
How did
situation.
you get in? I mean, now that you've started it.
I think I had to let them in on the fact that I'd gone on this walk, and it was quite traumatic. But anyway.
Well, that should be the worst thing that ever
exactly.
happened. Right.
But as I say, it's funny.
Yeah, it is funny.
Looking back on it.
It is funny. Now, I'm sure that our viewers are interested in how you and David Eisenhower got together. Obviously, your father was vice president before he was president, with General Eisenhower as president. And how did this romance evolve?
We met as children in 1957 at the second Eisenhower inauguration, and I do remember him. And we played together at the White House, and he was very cute. I thought.
He's still cute.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, what happened is just before I went off to college, Mamie Eisenhower and I met at the funeral of a mutual friend of the Eisenhowers and Nixons, and we got to talking, and I think she really liked me. So when she found out I was 7 miles apart from David at Amherst College, she hounded him. You've got to go look up Julie Nixon. You've got to call on her. So I think finally he came over and called on me, and that was it. We never stopped dating.
Isn't that wonderful? Really. And I know when
she was matchmaker.
When I interviewed you and your husband last year, and he said there was such chemistry because you had so much in common.
That's right.
Yeah. And that really is remarkable and makes for wonderful home life, I think, and
Yes,
a lot to talk
and he
about.
has a great sense of humor.
Yeah. And you know, I've talked about the fact that you wrote 3 books, but last year, and now I guess it's on hold, but you and David were going to write a book together.
Yes, we do have about 400 pages of this book on the war in Vietnam and and my father's election. And the focus is, how is Nixon going to extricate America from Vietnam? We have about 400 pages done, but we've set it aside because David is so involved at the Annenberg School for Communications and his other work that maybe this summer we'll get back to it.
We were talking before about your father, President Nixon, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what he would do now with what occurred in New York. I'm sure that you never conceived of anything like that, and I'm sure he never did.
No. The world was shocked. And I think that's why we've gotten the support of so many nations we never thought would join with us in this war against terrorism. But we were talking about that for a few minutes, and one of the cameramen said something so interesting. He said, my guess is that your dad would be tough. And I think that's what President Bush is doing. When you work with bullies and aggressors and sneaks, you have to put on the tough, I mean business. There will be consequences attitude, and that's presidential leadership. Has to be done in the right way because you can't bluster. You have to mean what you say. And I think the reason that President Bush's popularity is so high is that people sense that he means what he says, he's going to take action, he's going to give it his all to change the way things are. And the other thing that I would add to that is that sometimes I wish my father were alive to help with the Mideast problem. I think it just breaks my heart to see what is happening to Israel and what is happening to her neighbors, the intensification of the fighting there, and I wish that we could see some diplomatic groundbreaking being made there. And I'm thinking, Richard Nixon, where are you when we need you? So,
you are on the board of trustees of a Judaic study in...
Center for Judaic Studies. Walter Annenberg is one of my mentors and good friends, and he asked me if I would be interested in doing this. And it's been a great experience because the center is at the University of Pennsylvania, so it's an intellectual atmosphere, and the attitude is, this is a center for Judaic Studies, but to understand Judaic studies, you have to understand the world. So we focus on Christianity, Muslims, and all 3 religions interacting together. And it's been a great experience to see what this center's doing.
It's just so sad what is happening there, because having been there many years ago when there was an understanding between both sides, and
you don't like to see the escalation of violence.
No, of course
but
not.
It will change. It will change.
Well, I hope so.
Has to.
How do you feel about Arafat? Or
are we on a family channel?
Yes.
Yes.
Use family words.
I think that probably his time to pass from the scene has probably come. I don't think he's helpful in the peace process.
You know what is interesting to me is that you and your sister, Tricia, both grew up in the same environment and spent time in the White House and everything. Politics throughout both of your lives, and yet your sister does not seem to have the kind of interest that you do in everything that is going on.
I think that's what's so interesting about having children, because my 3 children are all so different, and we've given them the same parenting, and my sister and I are just complete opposites. And she is more quiet and retiring, and that's called the way a child is right from birth. Yeah.
Has anyone ever approached you to go into politics yourself?
Actually, they have, but it never seemed something that I felt was right in my heart. I just didn't think it was right to our children for us to lead such a public life, and I don't think I have the necessary fire within which it takes to be in politics. I think my fire got consumed during the Nixon years when I was so active in the White House and so involved, and I almost feel that's a chapter I've done, and now I'd like to remain active and do things for my country, but perhaps not in politics.
You spent a lot of time with Dolores and Bob Hope. I know they've been good friends of the families as well as
They
you.
are so remarkable. And one thing I just loved, when my father spoke at the dedication of the Eisenhower Memorial Hospital, there was a distinguished group seated on the platform, so he began his remarks. Vice President Agnew, Governor and Mrs. Reagan, Senator Murphy, President and Mrs. Hope. Mr. Hope. I blew the line. President and Mr. Hope. And there was a huge laughter because Dolores, of course, was the first president of Eisenhower Medical Center, and Bob was just along for the ride. He was Mr. Hope, and she was Mrs. Madam President. But what a remarkable woman.
Yes,
I have
she is.
such admiration for her.
Yeah.
And her spirituality, everything about her, I just can't say enough. She's been the guiding force behind this hospital.
Yes, she has.
It was her dream.
Yeah.
And I'm just so proud that she's a friend.
You were at St. John, and a special presentation was made to you there, and you told a very funny story,
Yes,
which maybe our viewers would like to hear.
I have to clarify the Abilene remark. I love Abilene, and I love the Midwest. In fact, it's Nixon territory, so how can I not love it? It's always been my father's greatest strength. But Abilene, the only way to describe it is it's a very small town, and the best hotel is called Preem's Pride. It's next to the bowling alley. And my sister-in-law, who's married to a very successful Austrian businessman, was out in Abilene doing an Eisenhower event a year ago, and she told her travel agent to book her into the presidential suite. And when she got back from Abilene, the travel agent called extremely upset, worried, nervous. She said, "Ann, the bill for the hotels arrived, and it was only $55. There must be some mistake." My sister-in-law, who's very droll, said, "There is no mistake. We overpaid." So you understand, if you could choose to spend a weekend, it's called Palm Desert and maybe Abilene next year. So anyway.
That's a cute story.
But,
now, where do you go from here? You're here, and you also...
Very exciting news. My husband and I are returning to China for the first time in 26 years.
How wonderful.
Last time we were in China, we met with Mao Zedong on New Year's Eve, and we're going back, and we're hoping to meet with the Chinese leadership because we want to bring greetings from the daughter of the man that China calls our old friend. And we'll be presenting, because of the generosity of Reader's Digest Association, a film called Richard Nixon, Portrait of a Peacemaker, 30 years later. This is the 30th anniversary of his trip to China. It will be about his trip to China with never before seen footage of him meeting with Zhou Enlai on the airplane and conferring, and behind-the-scenes film that the Digest is helping the Nixon Library prepare for this exhibit. So it's very exciting, and my husband and I are going together over his spring break from Annenberg School.
Well, your mother was a teacher, wasn't she, before your mother and father were married?
Yes, she taught high school, and she was head of the pep rallies and had a lot of fun doing that. Loved young people.
What I'm thinking is here your mother was at one time a teacher.
Yes.
And now you're married to a man who's a professor and a teacher. So
absolutely.
you've
And our
gone back.
daughter is trying to get her advanced degree to teach also. So I think it must run in the family, maybe even more than politics.
I don't know. There's
We'll
a
see.
lot of both.
That's
there
right.
really, really is.
Yeah.
I think, again, I just think it's great that you're here. And I'm wondering, after China, I mean, what other projects do you have?
After China, I think I'll come back and make up with my 17-year-old who isn't so happy that I'm going to China. No, she's... The one thing that's been great about the political life is that it's exposed me to extraordinary people. And I was speaking to my 17-year-old on the phone today, and she said, "You know, I'm just feeling a little down." And I was saying to her, well, we all get down. And I said, what you have to remember is to associate with the people who are up and who have dreams and who keep going. And I was thinking of the friends here on the desert like Lee Annenberg.
Wonderful. I want to thank you again so much for being here. I appreciate it so much. I really do. And we will see you, of course, right here.